Hi, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Alex Moses. I am the team dietitian with Mahoria Training, and I actually just wanted to come on here to help bring light to this new food pyramid, and what it all means, and hopefully explain a little bit about how you guys can use this information for you and your own diet. So, before I really get into the new stuff, I really just wanted to explain a little bit about the history of the food pyramid because I think it's important for people to understand where this is all coming from. So, we first started with a food pyramid that you may have seen on the internet, and it is this little black pyramid. There we go. This little black pyramid. It was created in 1992, and basically it is showing foods that we want to eat more of towards the bottom, foods that we should be eating less of towards the top. So in 1992, they had grains, including bread, cereal, rice, pasta, in that group on the bottom. So they were recommending 6 to 11 servings in a day. Veggies coming in as the next biggest group with 3 to 5 servings. Our fruit at 2 to 4. Milk, yogurt, and cheese were one group at 2 to 3 servings. And then meat, poultry, fish, beans, eggs, nuts, basically all your protein foods at 2 to 3 servings in your day. And then at the very top, we had our fats, oils, and sweets. Okay. So basically it was saying like, hey, we need to be having more grains, including some fruits and vegetables, don't need as much dairy and animal products, and then we need the least amount of fats, oils, and sweets. Okay. So that was our first version. Then 2005, we came out with this other one that is on the right. It looks a little bit cleaner, just visually. But basically, it was the same recommendations, but in this new way. So, still had grains as our biggest category, then vegetables, then fruits, then milk. So, the milk group starts to grow a little bit. And then meat and beans. And then still that very small category is our fats. Not a ton change between these, just between like visually how they look is the biggest difference. But there is a little bit of a stronger recommendation towards dairy or milk. And that is a lot to do with the dairy industry starting to fund a lot of this. When we get to 2011, we switched to the My Plate. And up until a few days ago, this is what we had. So it had been since 2011 that we changed anything. But in 2011, we basically took the food pyramid and said, this is too confusing, this is too much. We should be including all foods on our plate. This makes it look like some foods are better than others. So let's do this plate so you can see, like, hey, we should be having like fruits and veggies as half of our plate. Still need those grains, still need a protein, but the protein is the least amount on the plate. And then dairy is on the side. Again, a lot to do with the fact that the dairy industry funded a lot in this government initiative. What a lot of people didn't like is that it didn't include photos like it did in the other ones. But for the most part, a lot of people like these because it focused more on individualism. So a lot of dietitians, such as myself, would take this plate and be like, okay, like based on what you like, hey, as long as like half your plate is fruits and veggies, like that's okay if you have a little bit more fruit than veggies because we kind of have them at least half your plate. And as long as it's looking like that, we're good. Same thing with grains, like, hey, if it's like a quarter of your plate, we like that. And if there's a source of protein, we like that. And then the dairy was kind of the controversial point where it was like, do we need to be drinking dairy? A lot of us grew up, I know for me as a millennial, grew up with a glass of milk with dinner every night. A lot of it to do with the start of this pyramid as well as the plate, including the dairy. But a lot of people first not entirely sure what reason decided that these were including or promoting more processed foods. So we ended up with this new pyramid that the new administration has come out with. They basically flipped the pyramid and have whole grains as the group we should be having the least amount of while promoting protein, dairy, and vegetables at the top. So let me go to the website. So this is our realfood.gov website. So this is where you can find a little bit more information on this. Unfortunately, you have to scroll through all of this to get to the pyramid. Here is what I can say. There are a lot of things that, as a dietitian that goes off of nutrition research, I do not like about this, but there are a few things that I do like about this new pyramid. So the new pyramid does focus very heavily on whole foods. So I do like that there is an emphasis on that. It shows pictures, which I think are easier for a lot of people to understand. It's visually obviously very appealing. It gives examples in each group, which I think is a really, really good thing. I think that that was one thing that the plate was lacking, but they were trying to simplify by going to the plate. So that was kind of going against it. I think that this at least gives people examples in those food groups that are good examples. I also really do like that it includes frozen and canned. I wish that it included some like frozen and canned fruits or proteins as well. But there are options on here for frozen and canned vegetables, which I think is good representation because the majority of people do rely on both frozen and canned things just because a lot of fresh produce or fresh food items in general go bad quickly. So a lot of people do like to have those things. They're convenient. They're often cheaper and things are canned and frozen at peak nutritional value. So a lot of times you're not losing on a lot of nutrients that you will with fresh foods. That is where most of my compliments do end with this because then we start to get into these new recommendations per food group. Again, visually as a pyramid, I do like the pictures. I do like that it's whole food based. The actual recommendations themselves, just to give an idea of kind of what the big changes are. Protein, the new protein recommendations are about double what they were in the past. So we used to have a recommendation of 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. So we did switch to one, talking in pounds, which I think is a good thing because most Americans don't know kilograms, even though the rest of the world uses that. But we are about doubling the recommendation. And for the general population, this is not well researched. The average person does not need this much protein in their day. And when you're eating that much protein, that means that you're likely not getting in some other nutrients. That being said, it can be a protein target for a lot of people, especially athletes, and especially athletes going through an injury. Those instances, there are instances for Gen Pop as well, like going through a surgery where like protein recommendations are higher. But for the general healthy person, this is extremely high, and research does not necessarily recommend that much protein. Again, it's not that a lot of protein is necessarily a bad thing, not to the level that most people are eating it, but when you start to eat a ton of another thing, that means that you're usually taking away in some other group when we really want to have a well-balanced diet of everything. All right. And then fruits and veggies, not a huge change. The original recommendations were 3 to 5 servings of vegetables. Now they're 3. It used to be 2 to 3 servings of fruits. Now it's 2. So not a ton of change there. Whole grains, significant change. So now looking at 2 to 4 servings in a day of whole grains. And now we're emphasizing just whole grains rather than just grains. And for majority of people who are looking to eat a little healthier, it is good to be aiming for more whole grains than not. But the one thing I don't like is that this isn't necessarily realistic for a lot of people. A lot of people include refined grains in their diets, and it can still be a part of a healthy diet as long as whole grains are the majority. So again, not it's not telling you to not have whole grains. I just don't like that it's reduced it so much and put it at the bottom of that pyramid, kind of demonizing the food group, kind of the reason that we were trying to move away from the pyramid in the first place, trying to include all foods, where a pyramid kind of shows that you're supposed to have some foods more than others. When you're talking individually, that's not always the case. For example, an athlete needs a lot of carbohydrates. This is emphasizing protein fats and vegetables, not necessarily the diet that is well researched for an athlete that needs a good amount of carbohydrate, whether that's from grains or from fruits. All right. And then to find things on more of our fats, because that's the other big part that has changed in the guidelines. So butter was heavily promoted in this new pyramid, despite the fact that we have continually found research in why we should be lowering saturated fat intake, as saturated fats are considered the unhealthy fat because they do tend to increase cardiovascular disease, and it's a big reason that people have high cholesterol. It was recommended, and you can see that it was recommended to lower the consumption of butter and to replace butter with oils that are higher in unsaturated fatty acids. That is what is researched as something that is better for the general public. And this little checked box means that no, they did not apply that in these guidelines. We want to increase the consumption of butter, but then we also are saying like we don't need to have other sources of saturated fat. So palm oil, vegetable oils that are higher in saturated fat. Basically, there was a lot of talk behind trying to decrease saturated fat, but they did not include butter as a source of saturated fat, even though it is. So that was another like point of contention with these new guidelines and with a lot of people who are within the nutrition community or within research that have an issue with this, because when you say to decrease saturated fat, but then you include butter as a healthy source of fat in these guidelines, that's very confusing for people because they don't know that butter is a saturated fat. So it's kind of a loophole way of them promoting butter without telling you that it is a source of saturated fat at the same time. I keep hearing about the dietary guidelines. What do they mean for what I should be eating day to day? So what I hope people take away from this or any of the past dietary guidelines is that you should be including all food groups. There is nothing that says you should be not eating grains, that you should not be eating fruits. All those things are included in a healthy diet. Hopefully, from this pyramid, you see the examples of those without seeing some of these quantities. Again, I don't necessarily recommend having more red meat than fruits and vegetables, kind of how this is portraying. The guidelines talk about balancing protein, carbs, and fats. How do I know if I'm getting that right without tracking everything? How do you know you're getting it right without tracking? Seeing everything on a plate and visually being able to see like, okay, like if half my plate is fruits and veggies, then I'm probably in a really good spot, was a really good way for people to do this, to see that without tracking everything. I think it's important to know that just because the visualization has changed doesn't necessarily mean that a point of research has changed, and fruits and veggies are still incredibly important. And just because it looks a little different on this pyramid doesn't necessarily mean that we should make it less than half of our plate. Again, it really depends on what your goals are, but generally speaking, general population in the States, we're trying to get closer to that. So I think that kind of visually seeing on your plate that all of these things are included and then talking with a coach or myself, depending on where you're at in your process, can help you with what those portions should really look like for you at an individual level, because it is a lot different person to person. When they say to limit added sugar, what does that really look like in real life? Like, do I need to cut out desserts completely? I really like this question. One thing that I really wish didn't go away on the visual dietary guidelines was the representation of sweets or added sugars, because it's kind of dismissed, and that's why this question is coming up. It's confusing when you see that, and yeah, of course, that'd be an ideal way to eat, but that's not necessarily how most people eat. Can you have desserts? Yes, you absolutely can have desserts. The new guidelines have a recommendation of no added sugar or severely limiting your added sugar. The original guidelines that were supported more by more research and included a larger population of the United States and what was a possibility for them was 10% of your calories, or even more recently, a lot of people started saying like 10 grams or less in a day. Um, is the ideal. I think that if you're trying to make a behavior change and you're someone who has included desserts or added sugars in your day to day for a long time and you're trying to reduce, it's better for you to reduce rather than cut out. Just historically, most people are going to crave that more and usually binge on added sugar if they keep depriving themselves of it. So if you want something, it's better for you to have a little bit of it. Under 10 grams is the most recent recommendation. So as long as you're sticking to that in most of your desserts, you should be okay. You'll see on a lot of like pre-packaged or highly processed foods that usually is a lot higher. If you're making baked goods at home, if you're making, those healthier desserts, like usually you can fall under those things, but that's the general guideline. Do I need to eat perfectly whole foods all the time or follow the guidelines? Is there room for flexibility? There's absolutely room for flexibility. Okay, new pyramid is strict diet. Flexible framework meant to guide better choices, not dictate exact meals. One core goal, eat real foods most of the time, which I completely agree with. Like, I wish that that was emphasized more in the visualization because, yeah, it should be real foods most of the time. The problem is that the new pyramid really just highlights whole, real foods and doesn't include those things like sweets or the occasional protein bar or an ice cream with your family. And that's where I don't necessarily like this because, and the very, very old one with the Black Pyramid in 1992. That little part at the top was for your sweets, oils, like it was for those times in your life that you're meant to just enjoy and you're not necessarily looking to just have those real whole foods. So yes, I do think that there is a time for you to have flexibility. How should I think about these guidelines if my goal is fat loss, better energy, or just feeling healthier overall? I think that, again, it depends on the person, but most people going through a fat loss or weight loss journey, you should be following something pretty similar to the whole foods aspect of this. The portions of things and the recommendations on here can't say that that's necessarily for someone that is trying to lose weight. Not sure what your history is, but just generally feeling healthier. I think that if you were eating more whole foods similar to the examples in this, you would feel that. But when it comes to the fat loss and better energy, I think that that is incredibly individualized. And again, something to talk about with your coach or myself to know what portions you should be having of these things. Because some of the recommendations on here, I don't necessarily agree with for the majority of people, let alone someone who is trying to change their body composition. How do I know how much I should be actually eating based on my activity level and lifestyle? Great question. I think that this is, again, like, I'm sorry that this is just me repeating that, but I think that that's, again, something very individualized. But if you want to know kind of how we figure that out, basically, when you take your height, your weight, your age, your gender, all of those things play a factor into what your resting metabolic rate is. And then basically we take that number and then see how active you are. And from that, that's how we kind of decide like, okay, this is about where you should be at calorie wise. So that's an important factor when we're talking to you guys as clients. But also, I think that the activity level and lifestyle, because that can change so frequently. That's why it's so important to have someone guiding you if you are new to like creating a plan or working towards a new goal. If this is the first time that you're doing that with guidance, that's kind of a huge benefit of it is if you have changes in your lifestyle and activity level, we can change your plan to that. So the same way that a coach can change your workout routine based on how your routine is changing in the week, you can also change what you're eating and how much food you might need. So if you're going on vacation to Europe and you're going to be walking a ton, but you're not necessarily lifting. That changes your activity level. Same where if you get injured and all of a sudden you're not able to work out or lift the way that you were before, that's another place where like, oh, okay, we really need to change, like how much you're eating. Hopefully that answers that question. But again, unfortunately, it's like super individualized. There's so much nutrition advice online. How do these guidelines compare to popular diets like low carb, keto, or intermittent fasting? So I think that, yes, you're right. Is so much nutrition advice online. It's a very unique time to be a dietitian and be in this field because I feel like half of my job is just battling what is found on the internet, which is not the same as my mom, who's also a dietitian, how she started her career. I know the Atkins diet was really big and like they were on the radio all the time. This is a little different. There's a lot more people with opinions and access to express those opinions. And it can be a lot and it can be very confusing for people. So I appreciate this question because it's a real issue. How do these guidelines compare to popular diets? I don't want to say that this is a diet, but it is promoting a more animal food based diet than the US has recommended in the past. Um, I do think that there is some outside industry influences on this. The emphasis on animal protein and animal fat is more relevant here than it has ever been before without necessarily the research to back that up. And keto is pretty similar in that where it's often promoting a lot of animal protein and animal fat. So I think that that part is similar. Low carb, this is promoting, I think, a little bit less carb than in the past, but not low carb. Like there is still a recommendation of fruits twice a day and whole grains a couple times a day, which low carb usually is less than that. But there is less carbohydrate than there has been in the past. Intermittent fasting, it does not talk about the timing of food at all in these guidelines. And actually, I'm not sure if they have ever talked about timing of foods in any of these guidelines. And I think that might be because this is like the US dietary guidelines, and there are so many people on so many different schedules that providing those guidelines would be very difficult. So, can't speak on the intermittent fasting side, but there is a few similarities to some other diets out there, but I would not say that this is necessarily a diet in itself. What's the best way to follow these recommendations if I'm busy, on a budget, or eating out a lot? Honestly, in short, which I hope you have gotten from the rest of this video, is I don't necessarily think that you need to follow these recommendations. I think that there's always flexibility, but I think that this version more than ever is not necessarily research backed and not something that I would necessarily be recommending to the majority of people. So, if you're busy, if you're on a budget, if you're eating out a lot, I think if you're going to take anything from this pyramid and recommendation from it, it's try to include more of these kinds of foods. So, like when you're looking at here, you see a lot of color, you see variety, you see all the food groups represented. The majority of your diet should look like that. Besides that, there is room for flexibility. So if you're eating out a lot and you include broccoli on your plate with a chicken tender, that's a win. Like that's something that you probably weren't doing in the past that is helping you towards a goal. If you're on a budget, like there are frozen and canned things represented on here, like take advantage of those things. I'm glad that those are represented on here. That's one thing to really take away from here. And the busyness, again, this doesn't really talk about the timing, but that's another place where a coach can really help you out on how to fit in all of these things and how to add in more whole foods into your schedule if you are busy. So I hope that this was helpful. I hope it added at least a little bit of clarity to what this is and what it's coming from and what the recommendations are and maybe like what you should take away from it and maybe not. If you have any other questions on this, please reach out to your coach, reach out to Justin, reach out to me if we've already connected. I am here to answer questions. I know that this is confusing, but Mahoria is here to help, and so am I.